Right now, across Canada, thousands of people are refreshing their browsers looking for information on remote area border crossing changes. The headlines talk about new security protocols, updated identification requirements, and the digital tracking of travelers. Most people see these updates as a bureaucratic hurdle, a minor inconvenience in their travel plans, but they are missing the bigger picture. When we talk about remote areas in this country, we aren't just talking about a lack of cell service or a long drive between gas stations. We are talking about the fringes of the known world. Canada shares the longest undefended border on Earth with the United States, nearly 9,000 kilometers of invisible line. But undefended is a misleading
Place your
word.
hand on the scanner.
While the official ports of entry are staffed by officers in climate-controlled booths, there are thousands of kilometers where the border is guarded only by nature itself. These are the places where the forest is so thick you can't see 5 feet in front of you, where the mountains rise like jagged teeth, and where the silence of the tundra can drive a person to madness. In these remote crossings, the real changes aren't written in government policy manuals. They are etched into the landscape in the form of abandoned outposts, unmarked graves, and the footprints of those who tried to cross and never came out the other side. Tonight, we aren't looking at the permits or the paperwork. We are going beyond the steel gates and the barbed wire. We are opening the files on the forbidden borders, the places where Canada ends and the unknown begins. Welcome to the Kanata Files. To understand just how surreal a border can become, we must travel to the easternmost fringes of the country, to a place that defies all conventional logic, Campobello Island, New Brunswick. Looking at a map, this island resembles a jade pendant dropped into the Passamaquoddy Bay, but its rugged natural beauty masks a biting geopolitical irony. Despite being sovereign Canadian territory, reaching the rest of Canada by land requires a bizarre pilgrimage. Residents must cross an international bridge into the town of Lubec, Maine. They then have to drive through American soil before being permitted to re-enter Canada at a different checkpoint further up the coast. For those who call this island home, the headlines regarding remote area border crossing changes aren't just dry administrative updates. They represent a daily battle for normalcy. When border regulations tighten, the umbilical cord connecting them to Canadian groceries, healthcare, and family is severed by a line they did not draw. But there is more to this island than just a logistical bottleneck. Campobello is a sinkhole of time and historical shadows. During the volatile era of Prohibition, the maritime boundaries surrounding the island became a playground for ghosts. Rum runners mastered the art of using the island's perpetual, bone-chilling fog to transport illegal cargo. They played a lethal game of cat and mouse with federal authorities from both nations, turning the bay into a labyrinth of secrets. Local elders still whisper stories that send shivers down the spine of anyone listening. Tales of ghost boats appearing in the middle of the bay during the thickest fogs. These vessels fly no flags, carry no hull numbers, and most disturbingly, their engines make no sound as they glide across the invisible international line. There are archived reports of patrol boats chasing flickering lights across the water, only for them to vanish the moment they touched the US-Canada maritime limit, as if they had stepped through a tear in the fabric of space. The isolation of Campobello has also fostered a psychological phenomenon some researchers call border fever. When every basic act of life, from buying a loaf of bread to seeing a doctor, is subject to the scrutiny of two governments, The line between security and surveillance begins to blur. There are documented accounts from the 1970s of mysterious disappearances involving tourists who went for walks along the southern cliffs. Their cars were found, their clothes were recovered, but not a single trace suggested they ever left the island or passed through the official checkpoint. Did they simply fall, or did they inadvertently step into a gray zone where law and reality no longer apply? Furthermore, the presence of the Franklin D. Roosevelt estate on the island adds another layer of intrigue. Why did one of the most powerful presidents in American history choose a remote Canadian island as his beloved summer retreat? Some fringe theories suggest that Campobello's unique geography, stuck between two nations but belonging to neither when the fog rolls in, made it the perfect location for clandestine meetings that were never recorded in the history books. Today's remote area border crossing changes may be more than just policy. They might be a continued effort to monitor the secret passages that generations of shadow travelers once used to enter and exit the island undetected. Campobello reminds us that a border isn't just a political agreement signed on paper. It is a physical barrier that can turn a paradise into a prison. It raises a haunting question. What happens when the rules change, but the geography becomes a trap? When you stand on the shores of Campobello, looking toward the distant Canadian mainland that you cannot touch without another nation's permission, you understand the true meaning of being a lost Canadian. The file on Campobello is proof that in these remote reaches, the line separating two countries sometimes runs straight through the hearts of those who live there.
In the frozen reaches of the north, the border is more than a line. It is a brutal, vertical reality. To understand the ghost ports of the Yukon, we have to go back to the height of the Klondike gold rush, a time of fevered madness when tens of thousands of stampeders poured into the north, desperate for a fortune they would likely never find. To reach the gold fields of Dawson City, they first had to survive the Chilkoot Pass, a 45-degree wall of ice and rock that served as the primary gateway from Alaska into British Columbia and the Yukon. At the very summit of this pass, 3,500 feet above sea level, sat one of the most remote and terrifying border crossings in human history. Here, the Northwest Mounted Police established a customs post that defied all logic. These were not the climate-controlled booths we see today in the wake of remote area border crossing changes. These were tiny wooden shacks physically lashed down to the mountain with thick iron cables to prevent them from being swept into the abyss by 100-kilometer-an-hour winds. The Mounties who manned these posts were the absolute law in a lawless land. Their mandate was simple but crushing. Every single stampeder crossing into Canada was required to carry 1 ton of supplies, enough to survive a full year in the wilderness. If you didn't have the gear, or if you couldn't pay the duty in gold or coin, the NWMP turned you back. They stood there in their heavy wool tunics, frost clinging to their mustaches, acting as the ultimate gatekeepers. Thousands of men and women, exhausted and broken, were forced to make dozens of trips up the golden stairs, steps carved into the ice, just to get their mandated ton over the line. Many collapsed and died right there at the feet of the law, their bodies often left where they fell, slowly buried by the shifting snow. Today, the Chilkoot Pass is a rugged hiking trail, but the border post is a ghost. The shacks have long since been crushed by glaciers or reclaimed by the mountain. Yet, for those who brave the hike, the border remains active in a much more unsettling way.
Hikers frequently report seeing figures at the summit, men dressed in 19th century wool coats and wide-brimmed hats, standing motionless at the exact point where the old customs house once stood. These figures don't move, they don't speak, they simply watch. When approached, they vanish into the swirling spindrift. Even more disturbing are the auditory echoes of the pass. Some claim to hear the phantom sound of a hand-cranked siren, a device used by the NWMP over a century ago to warn of approaching avalanches. Others hear the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of boots on ice, even when they are alone on the trail. In the Yukon, the border isn't just a political boundary, it is a memory bank of human suffering. The government may announce new remote area border crossing changes to modernize the North, but you cannot modernize a graveyard. The ghost ports of the Klondike serve as a chilling reminder that when you strip away the technology and the modern permits, the border is a place of judgment. Those who failed the test a century ago never truly left the pass. They remain as the silent guardians of a line that nature has already erased, but the spirits refuse to abandon. In the Yukon, you don't just cross into a different country, you cross into a different era, one where the border was a test of your very right to exist. To truly understand the most forbidden reaches of the Canadian border, we must leave the mountains behind and enter the 6-month night of the high Arctic. During the height of the Cold War, the border was no longer just about customs or gold. It was about survival on a global scale. This led to the creation of the D-Line, the Distant Early Warning Line. It was a technological iron curtain made of radar stretching across the top of the continent from Alaska to Greenland, designed to detect Soviet bombers before they could reach North American heartlands. These were the most isolated border crossings on the planet. Men lived in radomes, strange geodesic domes that looked like giant golf balls dropped onto a white desert. They were the silent watchers of a forbidden frontier, stationed thousands of kilometers from civilization, where the only thing between them and the North Pole was a radar dish and a thin sheet of metal. These men didn't check passports, they monitored the very edge of our sovereignty, where any remote area border crossing changes meant the potential end of the world. For these observers, the border was not a line on a map, but a green glowing screen. While the official mission was to watch for Soviet Tupolevs, declassified documents and veteran accounts tell a much stranger story. Many radar operators reported objects that defied the laws of physics, unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAPs, that moved at hypersonic speeds, making instantaneous turns that would crush a human pilot. These objects seemed to congregate near the most remote border points, almost as if they were aware that these were the gaps in human surveillance. Take, for instance, the case of Station Fox, Maine at Hall Beach. In the late 1950s, logbooks recorded non-ballistic targets that would appear at the edge of the radar's range, hover motionless in 100-mile-per-hour winds, and then vanish upward at speeds exceeding Mach 10. These weren't Soviet planes, they were something else. The government's reaction to these events was often shrouded in secrecy, leading to the sudden decommissioning of certain stations and their removal from official maps. Even today, as we track remote area border crossing changes, we are reminded that the North remains a blind spot. The government may update its sensors and its policies, but in the land of the midnight sun, the border remains a target for things we still cannot name. At these heights, the border isn't just protecting Canada from other countries. It feels like it's protecting our reality from whatever is watching us from the edge of the world. It is a frontier of the mind as much as it is of the land.
The final chapter of The Forbidden Borders is perhaps the most harrowing because it deals with the raw human cost of an invisible line. To the policymakers in Ottawa or the administrators updating the remote area border crossing changes, the border is a legal concept, a series of digital coordinates on a high-resolution map. But to those who have actually stood in the deep bush of the no man's land, the border is something entirely different. The no man's land is a literal 6-meter-wide strip of cleared forest that marks the 9,000-kilometer boundary between Canada and the United States. In the remote interior of British Columbia, this corridor stretches over jagged mountains and through valleys so remote they haven't seen a human footprint in decades. It is here that a documented phenomenon known as border paranoia takes hold. It begins with the silence. In the deep backcountry, the forest becomes so quiet that your brain begins to manufacture sounds to fill the vacuum. It starts as a low-frequency hum, then shifts into what sounds like distant rhythmic whispering. Your compass, affected by localized magnetic anomalies, or perhaps the strange geological composition of the border peaks, begins to spin. You are standing in a perfectly straight corridor of cleared trees that seems to stretch to infinity. You can see your destination, but suddenly the logic of the forest changes. Every tree looks identical, every shadow feels like a watcher. You are in a space that belongs to no one, and in that space, you realize how fragile your connection to the civilized world truly is. Every year, people vanish into this void. Some are fugitives, believing that a remote area border crossing is their ticket to freedom, only to realize too late that the wilderness is a far more unforgiving warden than any prison. Others are experienced outdoorsmen who simply step off the map. Consider the chilling case of a hiker in the late 1990s near the 49th parallel in the Kootenays. He was a veteran of the bush, yet he was found 3 days after being reported missing, less than 50 yards from a well-marked trail. He was in a state of total catatonic shock. His clothes were perfectly clean, no mud, no tears, but his boots were gone, and his feet were unscarred, as if he hadn't walked a mile on the rough terrain. When he finally spoke weeks later, he didn't talk about the cold or the hunger. He spoke about the figures in the clearing. Tall, gray shapes he claimed stood just across the line, beckoning him to cross into a place where the sun never moved and the wind never blew. This sense of displacement is compounded by the historical remnants scattered along the line. There are tramgak, outposts hidden in the mountain passes of the interior that have been swallowed by the forest. These are the forgotten ports that current remote area border crossing changes no longer account for. They sit there, rotting in the rain, marking a border that nature has already reclaimed. If you wander into these zones, you aren't just crossing between Hai Kwukza, you are stepping out of time. You are entering a gray zone where the rules of the city, and perhaps the rules of our reality, no longer seem to apply. The danger is not just in the environment, but in the isolation. Search and rescue teams often report that those lost near the border exhibit signs of dissociative fugue, as if the transition between sovereign territories caused a break in their psyche. The government's focus on remote area border crossing changes aims to secure these gaps, but no amount of policy can police a landscape that actively resists human presence.
We obsess over the remote area border crossing changes because we crave order in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. We want to believe that every valley is mapped, that every person who enters or exits our sovereign land is accounted for in a database. We want to believe that Canada is a completed project, secured by checkpoints and paperwork. But the forbidden borders tell a different story. They tell us that Canada remains, at its core, a frontier nation. They tell us that there are still places where the shadows have the upper hand. The border is not just a political boundary, it is a mirror. It reflects our history of gold-fevered madness, our Cold War paranoia, and our modern-day vulnerabilities. It shows us the limits of our technology and the fragility of our control. Next time you look at a map of this great northern nation, don't look at the clusters of lights that mark our cities. Look at the empty spaces. Look at the jagged, lonely lines where the roads end and the green turns to white. That is where the real files are kept. That is where the truth is buried, waiting in the silence. This is the Kanata Files. Subscribe and stay curious, because the line between the known and the unknown is much thinner than you think, and once you cross it, there may be no coming back. Stay on the right side of the track.